If we had time, I would first not only offer you a greeting, but think about it with you. What is a greeting? What is it to greet? In Heidegger, reading Hölderlin, Andenken, the great hymn called Remembrance in English. So I'm so pleased to be here to attend to work with you and to devote ourselves to the seriousness of a certain kind of call that we have heeded against the grain. It is not obvious or in any way to be taken for granted, though it is a granting, that you left your lives, you left momentarily your abysses, your countries, your struggles and stress, your grief and grievances, in order to work seriously in a place that has historically, if we can now say historically, been very serious about hosting and appreciating the creative strength that you sustain in your work and your lives against institutional pushback and all sorts of destructive environmental, political, ethical disappointments that we all are susceptible to. I'm so happy to be here also after the stirring deliveries that we can't take for granted, and we don't know when they will be delivered to us, the stirring historical and stupendous deliveries sent off, because we don't know when this will arrive, sent off by Gina Dent and Angela Davis and my beloved friend and colleague Monty Adiawara. So I'm proud and humbled, and I'm going to maintain humble bear pose, which is something we can discuss, which I've learned to try to assume in times of very difficult strains that I hear and that I feel. So humble bear pose is my stature and lack of stature, my default position. And I think of the great bears and what they bear. So I also want to thank the great faculty here, the students, the people who come here and want to think together, even though it's sometimes like a rodeo. You have to hold on to that beast, let yourself fall and break a few bones and get back on. So try to hang in there and don't hesitate to interrupt at any moment. But let me begin by saying that I proposed the topic of the lamentable initially, and then I thought I'd wanted to do a sequel to some of the work I've done on immaturity. But the lamentable is what I offered to my great interlocutor, Christopher Finsk, thinking he would love it, and I'm always asking him to love something about me. So the lamentable, I was pushing off when I chose that. He gave me 2 seconds, but I nonetheless chose it. I was pushing off from the shores of my recent book on the complaint, a type of language usage still connected to the possibility of protest. So what does it mean to complain? Why are we in the age of complaint and social grievance? So it's still linked, the complaint, to the possibility of protest and rebellious pushback. Complaint appears to go against the strictures of docile compliance. There are questions of who gets to complain. Some Daseins don't feel they have the right to complain, and they never complain. Others are aroused by the hopeless mechanicity of complaining and complaining and complaining. So complaining seems to go against certain kinds of repressive strictures. However, as someone put through her obligatory paces by Nietzschean training protocols, I must switch on, whenever I'm working with something, the transvaluating machine. I acknowledge that there are good complaints that I encourage and I shelter when they arise, and bad complaints, liberatory types of complaining, and decadent, this is a Nietzschean vocabulary, decadent, joy-killing, life-endangering complaints that undermine progressive outlets. The voices and poses of white supremacy offer such decadent complaining, including that of the whiner-in-chief, the not my president, Trump. He's a major complainer and whiner. It comes from the Nietzschean decadence of launching, deadening complaints that create figures of hatred and refuse to be life-affirming. So bringing in a Nietzschean gauge to seize on our most distressing experiences may seem odd, but I urge us to practice it for the next few days to see how that may stir some ethical affect. I can explain that later. So as address and cry, I look at the complaint as address and cry, and some of you may adore the poet Rilke, who famously starts his duino elegies. Does anyone have it in their heart and voice right now? How does he start? Does anyone know it? Wer, wenn ich schrie, hörte mich. Who, if I were to cry out, would even hear me? So that's a problem of the complaint. The Rilkean crying, schrie, wenn ich schrie, so schreien, is picked up with some ambivalence, but in this case, affirming assumption by Heidegger, who writes about the Schreiben Schrei, or in French, the cri et cri, or it bumps harshly in English, the inscribing cry, so cry, so I'm trying too hard to be a crybaby. So to what extent is the grito escrito, to what extent is writing essentially co-intricated with screaming? In the case of Nietzsche, most shy and polite of men had to scream to be heard. So the address and oh, no wonder it's, you know, I'm all about unreadability, but not in this way. Okay, I'm like, holy shit, what kind of drugs did I have to? As address and cry, the complaint still seeks to change things around, even if in regressive formation, it just needs to collapse, but it still seems to have something like an intentionality that can change and move things. When you're complaining, you still have, no matter how rotten the tonality of your complaint is, you still have somehow a sense that you can move things around. By contrast, the lamentable is more existentially prone to its own abolition. to the powerlessness of language to seize upon change, turn things around, call out, and move worlds. To lament is to ground oneself in inescapable groundlessness. Werner Hamacher, one of the teachers who was here and whom we now summon, let us summon our teachers, our masters, our beloved interlocutors, as we think the lament and lament their absence. Werner Hamacher has argued when bringing together the Klage and Anklage, so the lament and accusation, that finally the lament seeks its own abolition, wanting to erase the reason for its necessity. So you see, the lament, when you lament, and you have to lament, you're raging that there's the need for a lament. So you want the lament to finish its run. A complaint, on the other hand, runs on repetition compulsion, feeding on its cause, no matter how vulnerable to refutation. So those of you may have in your ambiences people who nag or gripe or grouse, or am I the only one who was brought up on complaining Daseins, you know? And you can refute them or comfort them or tell them, no, it's okay, it's this way. But a complaint keeps on feeding itself on repetition compulsion, and it can't get over itself. For my part, I lament, I abominate, I decry a certain aspect of our lamentable immaturity. We find ourselves importuned, if not brutalized, by a country where those powered up and dangerously immature are caging the undefended, those marooned minorities, those minors trafficked and violated according to the prompts of a nihilistic disclosure. This is Chris Finsk's term when all those masculinist pathologies showed up in the election of 2016. I used my speed dial and heard from Chris that this is a nihilistic disclosure, a kind of lamentable disturbance that we could not have anticipated just a few years ago. Lacan reminds us that Freud never handled anger in psychoanalysis. There are many reasons for this. Let us try to think with our outrage and bring language to those in terrible grief and suffering. Our social bodies and countries actually need us. It doesn't feel like it, and they're in disavowal, and they devalue what we do. Our social bodies and our countries need emergency supplies of language, despite what one might think, as too many remain silent or stalled by obsolete yet re-emerging paradigms, motored by disavowal and mendacity. So I received some emails saying, when are you going to stop your language games with institutions who are in some ways persecuting you and come out and give us some language? This is what we need. I felt really called upon. Look, I don't have all the answers. You'll never hear me say that again. Okay. I must have been in humble bear pose as I was scratching this out today. I see my task and struggle as protecting the question, preserving a wildlife sanctuary for thought that is not dissociable from action, activism, the severity of accountability. I thought it was very poignant and powerful that Angela Davis spoke to us about the third critique a couple of days ago, emphasizing its importance and tying together certain irreversible links between critical thought and political commitment. The third critique of Immanuel Kant is a moment where he, as she pointed out, that suddenly the artist, the imaginary, is no longer tethered to the regime of the Begriff or cognition, the Begriff, the concept, that which subjugates one to reason and to force a certain logic through. The third critique is when Kant created a wildlife preserve for those aberrant beings who, in Nietzschean terms, do not have to bow to his lordship at the end of the day when you have to show what kind of results you can yield. In other words, Kant created a space for, I would call this hyper-responsible irresponsibility, the height of responsiveness to a call of being. I'm fast forwarding, as you can tell, that is not vulnerable to the policial tendencies of regimes of reason. So when you're working with cognition and knowledge and other highly valorized registers of tradition and values that we do cherish in so many ways, even though we do understand with Nietzsche and Foucault the genealogical payoff that the age of reason and reasonability has demanded. The prison system, the penitentiary of which Angela Davis and Gina Dent spoke so importantly, is an effect of the age of reason. When reason showed up and light showed up, incarceration started being installed. So those who did not conform were put away or confined or thrown into lockdown. So reason really comes at a high price, because whatever gets tagged as unreason has to be punished and thrown into some sort of cage. You know, that's the 17th century, the age of reason. Before that, you had Shakespeare's fools and idiots and mad people roaming around the streets as figures, says Foucault, of recondite knowledge. You'd listen to these maniacs and aberrant discursive holders. So we want to continue to think with Angela and Gina and continue to receive their gifts and their inscriptions. Now, another great friend is Philippe Lacoue-Labarthe, who characterized, and I hope this helps you with your work this session and this season, he characterizes our rapport to work according to three fundamental structures. Maybe you can say the names that you associate with the three fundamental relationships to work in the 20th century, primarily. So there's struggle. Whom would you associate with that appropriation of our relation to thought and being in terms of struggle? Where does the vocabulary and lexicon of struggle come from? Marx, right? And that structures, as you know, a fundamental way of thinking about things. Then there's struggle, there's mission, to be on a mission, to take the call of being. That would be a donation from Heidegger, whom I've critiqued a lot, so don't get anxious that I'm just mentioning him without some sort of disclaimer or proviso. I'm not afraid or intimidated by idiots or rednecks, or even though they can disappoint and hurt us in so many ways that are still unaccounted for. They still are sometimes the deliverers of a thought that can't be bypassed. So mission, and then task. Would you know which name you would associate with the Aufgabe? Yeah, Benjamin, Walter Benjamin. So these are three modalities, fundamental modalities of a relation to thought that I'd like us to consider and continue with. So, in fact, originally I wanted to trace an arc from Kant's thought, which began with Angela's first session with Gina, and his thought essentially on a portion of the Lamentable, which would be contained in the term or signifier or problem of immaturity. Immaturity. And I wanted to take it through Lyotard, who was a founding member of the EGS and a great friend of Finsk, and psychoanalysis, including a thought about Freud's comments on the pleasure we take in excrementalized language usage, such as that of presidential diction. Not that we take pleasure in that, but what it means to talk dirty, or what Freud calls what his reading renders as that of the jouissance, so the bliss of smut, in conjunction with some. So I wanted to think about this, but I can't, even though you might like to hear some smut right now, but what is it that excites in a human subject on the way to some sort of subjectivization? I'm thinking of someone that we love here, Slavoj, like that silo of smut and the jouissance. Or am I making it up? I know he's a gentleman and a scholar. So just when you find something a little surprising or jolting, let us, as co-thinkers and co-implicated in everything that we do here, let us subject everything to reflection and thought and not let it escape into some sort of opinion or what Heidegger would call, not entirely, it's my translation, the gutter of Gerede, or he calls it in English, idle talk. That's the translation. So I wanted to think about immaturity and smut and jouissance, the bliss of saying shit and hearing it sometimes. But I wanted to take it up in conjunction with some thoughts on Twitterature, something that Pierre Alféry, also who teaches here, has written about. So the lamentable quality of abbreviated forms of language that Heidegger saw as an effect of technology, a kind of immaturation of being. So for Heidegger to say EGS, CIA, FBI, NYU, to say these things is already a degradation, a desecration of language, but because you're circuited through technology and you can't even take the time to say a word in its difficult and presumed fullness. So let's be aware of that. I'm not saying you can change it or push against technology, but just be aware that we like to abbreviate LOL. So Kant wonders, have you ever really met a mature person? Think about it. Let me know if you really ever met a mature person. According to Nietzsche's tabulations, Goethe was really mature. But that's something one wants to think about, because his maturity consisted in an affirmation of what he called wiederholte Pubertät, so repetitive puberty. He was mature enough to know that he was always stricken with teen passion. Kant demonstrates how we are tethered to our immaturity, addicted to external types of restraints and authorities. So ask yourselves, put the scanners on, how much do I depend on another's judgment? However warped, distorted, painful it is, I'm still finding myself dependent on that. For Kant, that's immaturity 101. You have to find something that would disengage from that kind of dependency. We want to remain, however, this is Kant's argument in Was ist Aufklärung? So what is enlightenment? We want to remain in immature headquarters. I think you know this in case any of you have ever fallen in love or something and you like to talk baby talk and all that. It's also part of it goes in the column of jouissance and immaturity and baby talk and so on. Don't do it in front of me. That is our human bent, our lamentable predicament. Yet, sometimes you are called out of your immature recessions, shaken to the core, made to take a call that you cannot feel but must accept or drop according to the ethical exigency pressing on you. It is not easy to decline a call. Now, I've had a lot of babies around me. I'm thinking of those who are not with us as of recently. Stanley Cavell, has anyone read Bringing Up Baby? His work on bringing up baby, and thinking of Hamacher again, and I never stopped thinking of Hamacher. He wrote a beautiful essay about das Beben, which sounds like baby, but Beben is shaking, as in the earth shake in Chile. It's immature encroachment. I'm thinking of Anne Dufourmentel's Consideration of Childhood Trauma, my beloved Anne, with whom some of you worked, and she and I taught here. I thought as well of Derrida's thinking about Seneca, and in which Seneca says that there is an immaturity of every decline and death. In other words, every death is ever too soon. And these are events of time's complicated refusal to mature. But you can't complain about an earthquake or about death. You can't complain about it, you can lament. So, as for misogyny, one is pitted between complaint and lament. The seemingly unstoppable watch of patriarchal encroachment continually reasserts its irreversible intention. Do you know what it's like to be a girl? I mean, do you know what it's like to be a girl? To take corrosive insults all day long, to have to wrestle down insolence all the time, to wear yourself down, proving and outdoing yourself? overcompensating, pushing hard, becoming exhausted to the point of blanking, so much so that you can't even complain. A woman's job is never done, especially when she and her allies are historically sidelined, slammed by insult and dismissive grammars of power. So, where were we, asks the scholar? One cannot underestimate the traumatic whacks coming from institutional forms of hatred, the storm of grievances revealing the downside of blustering complaint, the complaint of privilege. You know, my brother works in aviation, and he says sometimes when they do runs in the so-called third world, and the conditions are very problematic and objectionable, where superpower people would never tolerate it, they'd complain. Certain underprivileged people just don't complain. There's also a nobility to that, but we need to continue to think about who gets to complain. The complaint of privilege is something that I track and think about. In terms of the backslides we are forced to witness, and in far too many cases made to endure, I can say little more than that I am stupid with grief. Enfeebled by so much injury, I am stupefied, at least for now, yet possibly for my time as a life form. How did it come to this? Is the wave of regressive malice new or very old, too old for memory to bank? Hey, I'm not done yet. Scanning the wreckage of nihilistic disclosure, I find a buildup of negative bequeathals. Trump and company, incapable of the production of value, stand merely as symptoms. We shouldn't be too focused on this as a cause or as a singular event. We have to also think about the Trump and co. as symptoms of an overdrawn account featuring the victory lap of predatory narcissism, part of the accumulation of nullifying discharge, reckless governance, stupefying stupidity, sci-fi villainy, child-slaying infamy, shabby morphs of Enlightenment prediction. However radically exposed, the weakness of the figure of man and what we think we need in terms of leadership precede the current sham manifestation in parts of the world of the assumption of power and roll call of agency. So as devastating and manifestly intolerable things are, this is not about these folks. The question would be what allowed them to install themselves and happen, and what are the metaphysical props and prompts and support systems that allowed for this kind of sham leadership and deadly morph in the figure of man to take hold. What is it that allowed this to happen to us? Not everything disclosed at this time is entirely new to us, for one finds so much inherited and brought forward by ancient habits of metaphysical positing, the particular resilience of exclusionary operations, which meet their most decadent outlet in the configurations that have allowed for a Donald Trump investiture and sustain his bumbling vulgarity. Somehow, we must find nurturance in social grief. the way legendary tribes in times of drought drew water from scattered roots. I tell myself that such destruction cannot lay us low, not definitively. This thought, more a petition than a declaration, is not anchored in certainty. I'm scheduled to come out of the grief I have swiped in, ready to rumble, unsticking from a uniformly frozen pose of medusoid petrification. I've gone in and out of inert states and their frenetic counterpart in hopped-up mobility, locked and loaded. How resolutely we lost. Yet to whom, to what, one continues to wonder. The scope of the loss that must be borne, massive, embarrassing, harbinger of body harm. I don't know how many of you get sick in certain ways and somatize with all of the obscenity that's going on in our shattered world these days. All of this pitches one into a catatonic stall whose shelf life and stealth articulations, somatic jostles, disturbed sleep patterns. Am I the only one with the shakes? Lost trust, rage outbreaks, unconscious scrapes, decisive breakups. I don't know how many people you've broken up with over some of the disasters circling through. Social suspicion. All of this cannot be fully predicted nor fully avowed. That's why I'm enumerating that you may not even be aware of a certain loss of trust that is taking hold of you. Under such circumstances, it is not clear how to maintain the protest engine set in gear, how to keep it viable and sustainable. The quasi-election in 2016, or whenever that was, it seems now not to be something you can nail with a date, of a team supercharged by masculinist pathologies, jolted us as a protest in its own right. So, for the time being, I sit in anticipatory bereavement of the next years, trying to rouse, looking for energy surges, and that's why I'm here with you, and the stores of public language that let me fuse for a spell with other citizens of rage, the righteous indignant. And this is something to consider if we had time, the necessity of expressing that one is indignant about things. The righteous indignant, the defeated and sublime whimperers. So I'm not even talking about the loud ones, the ones who are defeated and can barely articulate a cry. So there are defeated and sublime whimperers, like Native Americans. We just have to get still in order to hear that. Those in full catastrophe, hosting the lamentable without recourse, and the ones awakening, if it's possible, awakening to another logic of complaint, another daybreak, another logic of complaint, another daybreak. Ach, a girl can dream. So I want to know how your energy is, because I have a few more pages, but if you're done with me, that's okay. Can you handle a little more? I don't see anything. Yeah, I'm feeling good, but thank you. But I don't want to take for granted your docile bodies. It's very cool of you to be sitting, but you can dance or crawl or lie down or sit at my feet, whatever feels right. So, thank you. Give me another round. There is something that has obsessed me, a kind of recurrent motif, a plaintive cry put out in my prequel work, and that seems to be calling for attention now again. Embedded in the book on loser sons as provisional site of ending it all, one will find a sustained political reflection on late puberty and the phantasm of maturity. Let me ask you this again. Have you ever met a truly mature being, in the sense that exceeds acknowledging mere checkpoints of aging? So don't tell me I'm mature in that sense. And the disposition that allows for stepping back, lucidly cooling one's engines. There may be some human states of exception here and there, but they too show the tendency to lapse into immaturity. So Goethe, whom we mentioned via Nietzsche before, transcended first chakra nationalisms, regressive familialisms, and all manner of tribal bonding needs, credited, as I said, his growth to wiederholte Pubertät, recurring. If we had time to think about the temporality of something like growing up, grow up. But that is, when you say grow up, that's an adolescent utterance, isn't it? Who says grow up, Lyotard reading Malraux reminds us that there are no adults. It's a phantasm to grow up for all sorts of reasons. And there's all sorts of traumatic moments when you've lost your voice or can't represent what's happening to you and hurting you. Then you've slid into childhood's unspeakability, its pain, something again that Finsk has written about with tremendous care. It's not that I like him or anything. I notice I've mentioned him a lot, but I'm his student in so many ways. I've read that's my thing on friendship, which we'll discuss in class, how to be a friend or not. I read my friends, I read my students. There's something that I don't know how else to find them. And that's a way of not finding them too, but there it's okay. I've read all of Finsk, to my knowledge. I don't know what he's hiding from me. So the oversized writer Goethe counted on the returns of puberty. So returns also means the interest, the returns, the futures of puberty to move on with creative and libidinal abundance, inviting the double edge of abandon. In other words, what does it mean? As Jean-Luc Nancy, another one of our teachers here, he explains to us, you're abandoned, but there's also something like abandon, which is another form of indulged delight. And so there's the double edge for Goethe of abandon and sovereign trespass. He consistently abandoned himself to the returns of adolescent exuberance. And very often, even in Kant, as Kant gives us the third critique and a wildlife sanctuary to romp around in, Kant, and Angela was right, he had no taste, Mr. Judgment of taste. He was lauding the poetry of Friedrich II. Okay, if you ever read that poetry, you will throw up. But anyway, he never looked at an artwork, whatever. So where was I? Mr. Free up all the artists, honor them, lift them out of their subservience to political regimes or other policing attitudes and structures. He treats the poet as a puerile, stupid idiot who who, however, is somehow endowed with a gift. So the poet, when you really get deeply into the third critique, at once Kant performs a rescue op and a save of the poet, but he treats them like, well, the poet is a child, immature. The good child, the great child, the impossible child, who suddenly is endowed with the gift of language that has nothing to do with understanding, knowing, growing. So that's a double thing too, that the creative being, and that's how you're treated, am I wrong? Socially very often, as a child, as a minor, as immature, as not having renounced the pleasures and extra lucidity of being poets and thinkers. And thinkers are different, but still. Kant, even though he performed this remarkable save of our kind, he does so as though he were coddling a child, someone who can't be trusted, really. So, at the same time, Goethe was the poet who pressed claims about the correlative intensities of joy and suffering. So puberty isn't just joy, as I might have suggested, but consigns the upsurging child to pits of pain smoothed over only by the tranquilizing boons of so-called adulthood. So regressing or coming back to or returning to, I don't know if anyone wants to be a tween or teen anymore. Those were horrible, difficult years, because that initiates a relation to suffering that's very deep, and this is something that Goethe understood. Speaking of the East-Westerly divan, I have seen spasms of immaturity strike even the wisest gurus and sensible teachers who suddenly go infantile, giggle, play, shriek with laughter. It is not clear where to situate laughter, and here we could do a lot of work on laughter in Bataille, Freud, which is a Geschenk, a gift. What is laughter? How does it burst signification? So where do you situate laughter on the developmental scale, or even when evaluating psychic and somatic outburst? How to account for the spiritual or purifying capacities of laughter? Again, who gets to laugh? And if we had time, I'd go around and ask you to give me a laugh, because it could be a demonic laughter, or the laughter of the scientist who's going to take us all down, or, you know, there are many different kinds of laughters. Or in a grade B movie, in a trial, someone might run in and confess and say, I did it, she laughed at me. You know, so it's also part of the demonic feminine to laugh so it's a castrative power. So to what degree is laughter open to gender reassignment, or even the way it functions as a gift in Freud, and in terms of disrupting vital registers of significance, it has left an explosive hole in Bataille and Nancy. What happens when laughter rips through a fabric of intention or meaning? Puberty, perhaps not philosophically mature enough to have become a fully developed concept, sets up a breach, flagging a destructive passage on the road to majority. The minor hits a snag that may never entirely resolve, but is bound to return and deliver an unexpected knockout punch. Sparing only a few, puberty comes around the bend for the second and umpteenth time to offer faux replenishment, or the bumbled bad news of your finitude foretelling an imminent crash, driven perhaps on the ontic level by metonymies of the newly flaunted sports car, the unaccountable affair, or newly minted wife, a fresh store of aggression and ensnaring spree of Selbstbehauptung. It's a big concept in Heidegger, the body bump of untimely self-assertion. So Selbstbehauptung, when do you assert yourself, asks Heidegger. Ach, the return of puberty undermines the flattering growth chart that humanity assigns to itself. As shock and disruption introduced to the concept of developmentality, puberty is linked via Lyotard's political essays to Kant's remarkable statements about immaturity. Perhaps now more than ever, we need to look into the malefic drag of immature political behaviors. Do you have a little more energy? Yeah, okay. Because today was your day off, so you might be high or drunk or just saying. Please be sober by tomorrow, because I have paranoid detection systems, and you don't want to get in trouble with Monty. So he sets out from the insight, Kant does, that one wants to remain immature. Let me remind you again, I said it before, tethered to authority, kept on a short leash in an existential and political comfort zone that stalls growth and seasoned decision. In the chapter, Was war Aufklärung? What was enlightenment, rather than what is enlightenment, which is Kant's title. So I have a chapter called Was war Aufklärung? The Turn of the Screwed. I interrogate such a moment of faltering self-assumption as the passage through puberty. I return to this passage through puberty in Loser Sons. That's the book that I wrote anticipating some of our so-called leaders in the English sense, not the song, in order to seize on an issue that has not received sufficient airplay, H-E-I-R, and can help us move forward, if that is conceivable, with the Hamlet dilemma looping a hysterical knot that to this day tightens the noose around what we continue to incorporate and attach to, often unconsciously, as the political body. As weighty as Hamlet has been, I choose Hamlet because I assume you've all seen the film with Mel Gibson. No, that happened to me once when I was teaching at Berkeley in California. I love California, but still, they go, who? And they, and I didn't dare say the 16th century, because I thought that's really, I'm not going to make it here. So I said them, at the time, it was current. The Mel Gibson, and they, oh yeah, Hamlet. Another problem. So as weighty as Hamlet has been in terms of inheritance and gateway to the staple of infrastructuring themes of modernity, the play's remarkable resilience is also due to the flaws it exposes, the way it flatlines and plays dumb, trying to prompt traumatic truth to speak. A dumb show haunts the dramaturgy as it explores the limits of saying and showing, wondering aloud if it is capable of instigating confession and aligning with justice. One is throttled and voiceless, dependent on a ghost's directives and plaintiff insistence for motive and intelligibility. In post-Freudian psychoanalysis, by the way, it's questionable whether Hamlet's ghost, the father, is not lying. There are wonderful studies. Hamlet, who no doubt has slimmed down or was considerably photoshopped for the portrait we may carry of him, wallet or poster size, started out as a pudgy adolescent. I don't know if you caught that when you watched Mel Gibson. Bulked with body excess, he faces off with the bodiless inflation of paternal overdrive. How does Hamlet carry the weight of his heritage? When Lyotard moves on troubled adolescent awakening, he knowingly dwells at the limits of philosophical statement and determination, rehearsing that which may well lie beyond the scope of theoretical reach or investigation. Maybe the overweight waddle of Prince Hamlet is not a matter for speculation or the corporeal zoom, part of sizing his portion of indecisive agony. Or maybe he needed the carriage of young portliness, a way of taking up space in the kingdom that at once counted him out and counted on him desperately. What about the body of the prince? You know, I'm reading with Shakespeare, who asks about the body of the king, and I want to know more about the body of the prince. How does it reflect the political body? Bloated with gluttony, morally emaciated, morally deciphered, yet produces a strong alteration. Now, a strong alteration is what Freud designates as the episode of puberty. It's something, I'm skipping now, there's more to be said about Hamlet, but there's something that occurs when the turnover from childhood to majority is marked. And in a sense, Hamlet unfurls this anxiety of what Freud calls a strong alteration. Off target, yet on the way to them. There's a call that wakes someone up out of childhood and diverts someone, as it happens to Hamlet, and it's a kind of adolescent arrogance to think that you were born to set things right. This is something that I wanted to consider. Again, with the Nietzschean transvaluation machine on, there could be good answering or standing up to answer a call, or there could be a decadent one, such as not our president, my president, Trump, who thinks he's the only one called to fix things. These are adolescent tropes that we just want to beware of, but Freud sees it as a kind of traumatic insistence that is off target. It comes up as a call on the way to these adolescents or children who then are fatefully diverted because something drastic happens, an uncontrollable spill of being that jostles the kids, relating them to the unrelatable. Freud's example would be Emma, who suddenly, a girl who suddenly looked at differently and sexually sized by a shopkeeper, and she goes into a sudden traumatic swill in a certain way, or swirl, and she can't relate to this regard that is attacking her. The jolt that they receive when picking up the untranslatable call, or the call that only ever relays to its own untranslatability. Now, this is important. Something is calling you, something is heading toward you, but it's untranslatable. Only a maniac like Abraham, our Erzvater, our patriarchal father, would think the call is meant for him. And is translatable at all. So what happens to these children who are suddenly jostled by a call that they can't receive is that they are hit with the untranslatability of being called forth. And this evokes, according to Lyotard, I'm really condensing here, it evokes the shock of puberty, the rebellious blur bleeding out of the dilemma of impaired comprehension. This is Lyotard. What is happening to me? So impaired comprehension where you don't understand, is it happening? What is happening? What is happening to me? Even if it just means your voice as a boy is breaking. What's happening to me? So I didn't want to miss out on focusing a piece of Hamlet's commando reactivity, the specific way he remains enraged, yet stalled, rebellious, yet unable to execute a substantial plan or hit an assigned target. He's girlfriend bound, yet mother fixated, cute, but yet to lose the baby fat. So there's Hamlet as part of an unaccountable upheaval, the social out-of-jointedness which pertains to a condition at once common. Everyone goes through this self-estrangement that I'm calling puberty, more or less, and alien. What kind of freakish monstrosity just got released on the community of family, friendship, and nation political observers? According to Lyotard, the shock of puberty, the rattling call, shapes our political narratives, even as it apparently recedes to raise havoc on more unconscious channels of social behavior. If I'm getting this right, the brand of hysteria, because an adolescent is hysterical. I don't know if you've ever heard an adolescent scream at you, "You've ruined my life," because you said, "No, I don't think you should go to the movies tonight." This hysteria, ascribable to puberty, cuts into the spheres of political performance and agonized concern for justice in a number of ways. Don't forget that the concern for justice is also very infantile and childish. Who is the one who feels and cries about, "It's not fair"? Unfairness comes up very early. So that's a moment where justice is calling through to you. My own assessment, reading psychoanalysis, victims of recurring puberty, is that the excited teen running high on self-inflationary fuel and disrupted by an untranslatable address sparks the scene of action. Puberty's claims announce themselves each time uniquely in full revolt of what is. So this is something that I wanted to bear in mind, that puberty is in full revolt of what is, won't accept it, won't conform to what is. The runaway teen spirit, going nowhere fast, riveted by a sudden arousal and awakening, enters a stretch of being that remains enigmatic and active, infiltrating all manner of social practice. Occupied to a considerable degree by adolescent tropes of giddiness, overabundance, sarcasm, attack and ruin, the despondencies and of excitability, the stoppers and starters of social responsiveness still need to be accounted for, even if we lack a grid to tabulate the saturation of the political according to adolescent excitability. This doesn't even seem like it should weigh in, but it's something, according to Lyotard, and I think if you read psychoanalysis, that's very crucial to our understanding of political atrocities, even in the figure of something like the Hitler Youth, the Hitlerjugend, which is a bunch of teenagers acting as a political super ego. So there's something about adolescent excitability installed in political movements or structures that maybe we could consider, as hard as that is, aligned with Abraham and Emma. So Lyotard takes as an exemplary instance what happens when Abraham takes the call. His name changes, everything changes at that moment. In terms of the disturbing jolts visited upon these hapless receptors and written up by Lyotard, Hamlet, for his part, proves to be terror-riven as he tries to field a deracinating call that spurs him to stand up in submissive readiness. On one level, though very differently apportioned, they share the predicament of receiving an instruction, an intrusive charge and convocation. They are cocked to respond to a call. So you know that in Shakespeare, Hamlet says, the readiness is all. If we had time, we try to read Enos, the readiness. So they're ready for something to hit them. On one level, though very differently, there's something like a receptor that is waiting to be convoked. Their language or utterance might be ready or not. Adolescents are made to assume that a call is meant for them. Hamlet understands that readiness is all, but was he ready for what was coming at him? The call rips through them before they are ready to assume its meaning or what it demands of them. It's an instruction sometimes without content, and it is questionable whether the content furnished by the paternal overdrive that we call Hamlet Senior is something that bears meaning. So let me just skip for the moment and say that perhaps the time out that is still observed by Hamlet tonight, requires a renewed reflection on political action in the sense of Hannah Arendt, and the complaint of puberty in the sense of compromised sense. So what would puberty be in regard to significance or the making of meaning and political determination? Hamlet, excessive and reputedly ineffective, modeling the shocked incomprehension of a social body, has only himself to complain to. He has that famous soliloquy, so it's almost a complaint boomeranging to himself. What a piece of work is man. How noble in his reason, and so on. Hence the famous soliloquy, a filter of the unanswered call of anguish. Trump has Twitter to complain to and an arsenal ready to go off.